But if guys like Palmeiro were tainted, then suddenly fans had a neat and tidy explanation for the surge in home runs. Home runs went up because players were taking steroids and hitting for more power. This made the late 90s surge in home runs unnatural, suspect, even immoral. It was basically a result of cheating. Except here's the thing, and this is important, so really pay attention. Steroids did not cause the home run surge of the late 90s and early 2000s. They really didn't. In-depth work on this subject has been done by Jay Jaffe over at Fangraphs and a guy named Eric Weber, who built a standalone website called steroidsinbaseball.com to dive into the data on this subject. And what these guys generally find is that throughout baseball history, when there has been fluctuation in baseball's home run rate, it almost always comes down to changes in the ball. I mean, there are other factors, obviously, changes in the strike zone, hitting philosophy, ballpark dimensions, but that stuff is always in flux. And in general, baseball's home run rate doesn't change that much year to year, except when a new ball gets introduced, either because MLB switches suppliers or there's some kind of change to the manufacturing process. This is what happened in 1993, and the result was an increase in home run. Check out the SportsCenter segment from early in the 94 season.
Balls are definitely carrying.
The thing is scary is just watching all the opposite field home runs right now.
The players are really bigger and stronger and faster nowadays.
It's just like basketball. I think the basketball court's too small for those 10 big guys out there.
This year is a rim-rattling slam dunk for baseball offense. It used to be that the gold standard for home runs per game was back in '61 when Mantle and Maris both chased Babe Ruth. Remember '87? The talk of the juiced ball and a new mark for dingers. Well, holy homer, this year so far is on a record pace. Compare these first 2 weeks to last year's. The averages are up nearly an extra run and a half per game, and slugging is up 38 points. But the baseball's the same, isn't it? Well, Rawlings has moved its ball production out of Haiti to Costa Rica this year. It's got to be the baseballs.
They're harder. I know the balls are harder.
The funny thing about that segment is that it includes other theories as well. The pitchers are worse, the hitters are bigger. Nobody quite mentioned steroids yet, but everyone wants to find the problem in the players themselves. Few people were open to the idea that the problem was structural. Even the players are reluctant to admit it's because of the ball. And of course, the commissioner's office always downplays the impact of these equipment changes. But we can look at balls that are taken from games in play and notice changes in the springiness of the ball. And it's only a change in the ball that can explain the suddenness of a jump in home runs. After all, there's no reason that pitchers would get bad or that hitters would get big all at once. Any baseball fan paying attention in recent years has surely noticed this same thing happening again. In 2019, there were 6,776 home runs. That is over 1,000 more than were ever hit at the height of the steroid era. And while some cynics out there like to claim that guys were on steroids again, that just doesn't make sense given the timing. 2019 saw a 21% jump in home runs from the previous year. Only a change to the ball can change the game that quickly.
One of the things we need to keep in mind is that in the 1990s, the 94 strike screwed everything up. The shortened seasons in 1994 and 1995 made the increase in power look like a gradual thing, like the outcome of PEDs slowly making their way through the league. As we saw when we looked at the 50 home run seasons, those happened gradually. One year, then a few the next, then a few more the next, and so on. And so it seemed like an evolving trend, which would make sense if it were the result of more and more guys using steroids. But that's not what really happened. What really happened is that midway through 1993, after changes to the ball, the home run rate shot up all at once. In 1992, there was an average of 1.44 home runs per game. For the 5 years between 1988 and 1992, that number was about 1.5, never lower than 1.4 and never higher than 1.6. Then in 1993, it was 1.78. In 1994, the first full year with the new ball, it was over 2 home runs per game, a 43% jump from 2 years earlier. And that's where it stayed for basically 15 years. There was another brief, smaller spike from 1999 to 2001, which partially explains all those 60 homer seasons in that stretch, but the real significant increase in home runs happened earlier, and it happened suddenly. This would have been more visible if the 94 and 95 seasons had been the full 162 games, and we got normal home run totals from those years. In 1994, when the strike cut the season short 2/3 of the way through the year, there were 6 guys on pace for 50 homers, including Matt Williams, who was on pace for a record-tying 61. Not all of them were likely to have kept that pace, but remember, this was still in an era when only 3 guys had done it in the previous 30 seasons. How could steroids explain this? Did everyone in baseball all start doing steroids at the same time and start feeling the effects on practically the exact same schedule?
Sometimes you'll see a slightly softer version of the home runs were caused by PEDs thesis. People will say that even if the league-wide trend was due to the juiced ball, as well as other external factors, that the guys who benefited the most from those trends, the league leaders, the record breakers, they were all on steroids. But this sort of seems to be at odds with the idea that steroid use was widespread if its effects were limited to a few outliers. And more significantly, this isn't really borne out by the evidence. Most of the guys who have strong links to steroids were fringe players, not stars. And if you look at the guys who led the league and broke the records, yeah, you do see guys like McGuire and Bonds and Canseco who were linked to steroids. But you also see guys like Ken Griffey Jr. and Jim Thome and Frank Thomas who were never linked to PEDs.
Frank Thomas was never linked to PEDs, but he'll sell you some supplements late at night if you want.
Yeah, it's weird. Thomas was like a big outspoken opponent of like steroids, and he was very adamant that like testing should be strict. And now he like hawks Nugenex on like late night infomercials, which is like a testosterone boosting supplement. So like, I don't know. I like Frank Thomas, but come on, take a stand. Often people will treat someone's presence on the home run leaderboard in that era as proof that they use steroids. Guys like Jeff Bagwell and Mike Piazza were dogged by this stain for a long time, and it kept them from getting into the Hall of Fame for longer than it should have. And in addition to being unfair, but you can hopefully see the circular logic here. We know steroids caused home runs because the home run leaders were all on steroids, and we know they were all on steroids because they led the league in home runs. So what's causing what here?
I have a related hypothesis that has to do with how these narratives formed. Here I am on baseballreference.com, as I am every day. And I am noticing a pattern among the guys who immediately benefited by the juice ball in the mid-90s. In 1993, the home run leaderboard read this way. Tied at number 1 were Barry Bonds and Juan Gonzalez with 46 home runs. Then in third, Ken Griffey Jr. with 45, Frank Thomas at number 4 with 41, David Justice with 40. Now, that's a lot of black players. Then in 1994, Matt Williams and Jeff Bagwell did finish first and third in the home run totals when the season stopped. But the rest of the top 7 that year include Ken Griffey Jr., Frank Thomas again, Barry Bonds, Albert Bell, and Fred McGriff. Then in 95, Bell hits 50 in a shortened season along with 50 doubles, and baseball writers basically moved heaven and earth to instead give the MVP to Mo Vaughn, another black player who himself hit 39 that year. With all due respect to the Matt Williamses and the Jeff Bagwells and the Jay Buhners, the white players who also surged in these years, is it possible that baseball fans and writers were overlooking the accomplishments of an ascendant wave of black sluggers in the mid-90s?
Maybe, but the problem is they weren't really overlooking the home runs. Everyone loved dingers. This was the age of chicks dig the long ball and all the promotion of the home run chases. And a lot of the players you just mentioned were pretty popular. Most obviously Ken Griffey Jr., but also Frank Thomas and Mo Vaughn, who both won MVP awards in the 90s. I do think you're touching on something interesting, though, which is that this period in baseball was pretty unique demographically speaking. We talked in Chapter 2 about the wave of Latin American baseball players in the 90s. And at this point, you also hadn't yet had the precipitous decline in black players in baseball that has really characterized the sport for the last few decades. From 1991 to 1997, those were the only years in baseball that both black and Latin American players each constituted over 15% of baseball. And when you combine that with the salary explosion we've talked about in previous chapters, what do you get? You get a labor force that is increasingly diverse, increasingly well-paid, and increasingly powerful. And then, in some kind of magical coincidence, the steroid scandal pops up as a way to sow discord amongst the players.
Yeah, and even before then, I think the way certain black players and Latin American players to some extent also, the way they were viewed was a little preview of how fans and the media like to divide the lovable players from the bad ones. That's not to say that there were no beloved players of color. I mean, Ken Griffey Jr. and Sammy Sosa proved that. But the way guys like Barry Bonds and Gary Sheffield and Albert Bell were viewed was certainly affected by their race. I mean, even Jose Canseco has said the reason he wasn't as favorite as Mark McGuire was because he was Cuban.
Yeah, I'm not totally sold on that explanation. I think his long list of legal troubles, including multiple accusations of domestic violence, play a bigger role in why nobody likes Jose Canseco. Just one man's opinion.
And that's to say nothing of his repellent personality.
Yeah, exactly.